Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and this is our 162nd segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross. And thank you so much for joining us. We're going to do salvation history in 10 minutes. We go to our screen and we see the theme. Seeing Jerusalem in ruins, the gospel writers saw that 2nd Isaiah taught Israel to see God using wilderness time to speak to their heart, including John the Baptist. Finally, God's suffering servant spoke to the hearts of all from Calvary's Hill. How does this all fit together? We go to our next screen and we read Mark 1:3, Matthew 3:3, Luke 4:3. John came preaching in the wilderness. They all see it the same way. As written in Isaiah, that 2nd Isaiah the prophet. I send my messenger before me, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his path. So it says right here, in the wilderness, God prepares his way and he makes his path straight. Just as 2nd Isaiah had announced to the exiles their service in Babylon was redeemed and God's anointed would soon free them to return to Jerusalem, so now all the Gospels recalled by 75, realize they're doing this 50 years later, by 75 AD, that John the Baptist in 28 AD had announced that their service would soon be redeemed and God's anointed would free them for a new exodus to the Jerusalem on high. The original anointed was Cyrus the Great, but this one is Jesus. We go on to our next screen. 2nd Isaiah was sent to console the exiles in the 6th century BC, just as John the Baptist was sent to console the Am Haaretz, just as Jesus began his public life. Those excluded from the synagogue, that's who the Am Haaretz are, the people of the land. John the Baptist, super concerned for the Am Haaretz, separated him from the priesthood. His father was a priest, he was supposed to be a priest, and his association with the Essenes, who had educated him. The Sadducees and Pharisees disdained the great unwashed. That's the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. It's another name. And they did not allow them in the synagogue because they smelled. That's how disdained and pushed out they were. John's prayer and fasting in the wilderness reflected a deep longing for God to do something for the Am Haaretz. Now the church, looking back, saw John the Baptist living out 2nd Isaiah's words. What are 2nd Isaiah's words? Give comfort to my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim her service over, her guilt expiated. In the wilderness, prepare the Lord's way. See the parallels between John the Baptist and 2nd Isaiah. Fear not to tell everybody, here is your God, he's present. And he's like a shepherd, not a pharaoh or a king. Like a shepherd, he feeds his flocks and carries the lambs in his arms, leading them home. What a beautiful hymn. These words consoled many Am Haaretz, the 75% of Israel. And 50 years later, the Nazarenes, the Jews who turned to Jesus, who were excommunicated and dispossessed by Ben Zakkai, they felt the same way. We go on to our next screen. John the Baptist reminded the Am Haaretz, the people of the land excluded from the synagogue, that they were seed of Abraham. And if they repented in faith and lived justly, they'd share the inheritance promised. Even if they could not study Torah, they couldn't read and write, and that was shameful. And if they lacked the water to observe ablution rites, John's baptism purified them and freed them from shame to feel worthy to receive the inheritance. And why was John so concerned? His parents felt that shame. They couldn't have a child, and he felt it deeply for them. Now we go back and we say, how did this all happen in a historical background? Even the second exiles in Babylon could read, so they skimmed off the top of society and took them into exile. Thus, exiles assumed all true Israelis, as all those in exile, could study Torah. Upon their return, the exiles kept this attitude and had contempt for the Am Haaretz, who were left behind to farm fields. Okay, we go on to our next screen. Aware of this attitude in the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and it really angered John, Matthew and Luke 3-7, John the Baptist said, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee the wrath to come? Do not say Abraham is our father, for God can raise children of Abraham from these very stones," which happened in the church. And then we go back and say from Isaiah 5:11, "If you desire justice, look to the rock quarry from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham your father and Sarah who gave you birth. Were you born justly because you deserved it? Not at all. Sarah and Abraham had a rock quarry. They couldn't have children, and miraculously and wondrously, God gave life to the community. None of you deserved it." John knew Isaiah well. A wondrous gift of life no Israeli deserved. How can they claim they are more deserving than the Am Haaretz? We go on to our next screen. Second Isaiah redefined the word redeem. Originally it meant to give back value. But second Isaiah proclaimed that God could redeem a curse of no value into a blessing that gave life. The synoptic writers were aware of Galatians 3:13, where Paul said God redeemed the curse of the cross into a blessing. The cross had no value, but God made it eternally valuable. Second Isaiah saw the Babylonian exile as a curse redeemed by God into a blessing for the exiles who finally allowed God to speak to their hearts. So what is the good about the wilderness? That's where people listen to God. Thus, during the exile, second law re-edited and completed. And the second law means Deuteronomy. And priest re-edited and completed Torah as we read it today. So there was wondrous re-editions and completion of the Bible as we have it today during the Babylonian exile. We go on to our next screen. Further, second Isaiah taught the three most transformative ages in Israel history were in the wilderness, living as wayfarers, aliens, or resident aliens. The first, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, journeyed as Bedouin tribesmen. Moses, as God's pedagogue, taught law in the wilderness. God redeemed Israel's sinful, broken ways during the wilderness of the Babylonian exile. And we're looking back and we see all of salvation history right there in those three formative learning periods. We go on to our next screen. The church took Isaiah's teaching further. A fourth dimension would be that believers in the church felt dispossessed after Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD. The Nazarenes, the Jewish believers, experienced a new wilderness, which freed them from Jerusalem's over-domestication. So it turned into a blessing immediately. Thus they realized that they lived in oneness with the Israel of the wilderness. Their hearts always open to God's loving presence. In the wilderness, you're more open to God. And the church realized that they were doing right. The fifth dimension, or the fifth wilderness, in oneness with Peter's journey to Rome. He was an immigrant. He was a journeyman, a wayfarer. The true Israel journeyed through this world to the Jerusalem on high in God's heavenly kingdom. We go on to our next screen. Lastly, second Isaiah wrote of the heroic suffering servant who vicariously suffered to redeem Israel. In the fullness of time in God's grace, he was clearly referring to Jesus. In Isaiah 53, it was our infirmities and suffering he bore. Like sheep, we all had gone astray, but the Lord laid upon him the guilt of us all. Like a lamb led to slaughter, he was silent and opened not his mouth. We go to our next screen. Isaiah 53:11, through his suffering, my servant will justify many. Their guilt he will bear. Because he surrendered himself to death, he shall win pardon for the sins of many. Jesus fulfilled Isaiah's words on the wilderness of Calvary's Hill. Second Isaiah enlightens us to see all salvation history as God's power, redeeming curses into blessings. And we read, seeing Jerusalem in ruins, the gospel writers saw that second Isaiah taught Israel to see God using wilderness time to speak to their heart, including John the Baptist. Finally, God's suffering servant spoke to the hearts of all from Calvary's Hill. Thank you so much for joining with us as we try to do so much in these 10-minute teachings. I want to thank Jason Brown and Martha Velez and Nancy Staiano for sticking with me for these past 4 years. Thank you so much for joining us for this 162nd segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross.